Hey guys, tonight we begin with what partying in ancient Rome was really like. And trust me, your wildest college kegger has absolutely nothing on a Roman banquet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore how the Romans turned dinner into a full contact sport. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Roman parties. Most people picture togas, grapes being fed by hand, and maybe some light philosophical discussion while reclining on marble couches. In reality, Roman banquets were more like a combination of competitive eating contest, reality TV drama, and performance art piece directed by someone having a complete mental breakdown. This wasn't some refined gathering of cultured aristocrats sipping wine and discussing Cicero. It was wealthy Romans trying to out-weird each other while slaves desperately tried to keep everyone from dying of alcohol poisoning or choking on peacock tongues. Think less sophisticated dinner party and more. What happens when you give unlimited resources to people with absolutely no concept of moderation and a burning need to prove they're more important than their neighbors? The late Roman Republic and early Empire wasn't your typical ancient civilization where everyone went to bed at sunset and woke up to tend their crops. Rome in the 1st century BCE and CE was essentially Las Vegas with better architecture and worse plumbing. The city controlled most of the known world, which meant exotic goods, slaves, and wealth flowed into Rome like water down a drain. Except the drain was broken and everything was backing up into increasingly ridiculous displays of excess. If you thought Roman society was all about duty, honor, and civic virtue, think again. At least not when it came to the ruling class and their legendary parties. The wealthy elite had so much money, they literally didn't know what to do with it. So they decided to spend it on increasingly elaborate ways to show off while eating themselves into food comas. We're talking about people who would import snow from mountains just to have chilled drinks, who kept exotic animals as dinner entertainment, and who thought the height of sophistication was serving dishes that cost more than most people's annual income. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, controlled everything, and if he decided tonight's dinner party needed dancing bears and a fountain that dispensed wine instead of water, well, that's what happened. Social status was everything, and nothing said, "I'm more important than you." Quite like throwing a party so expensive and ridiculous that people would still be talking about it months later. Enter Gaius Petronius, known to history as the Arbiter of Elegance under Emperor Nero. Basically the ancient world's version of a lifestyle influencer, except with unlimited government funding and significantly fewer moral constraints. Petronius wasn't just wealthy. He was the guy other wealthy Romans looked to for tips on how to throw the perfect party. His banquets were legendary throughout Rome, and not in a good way. But here's where it gets interesting. Petronius was actually satirizing the very culture he seemed to embody. He wrote the Satirical, one of the earliest novels, which included a dinner party scene so over the top that scholars still debate whether he was describing real Roman excess or just making fun of it. The dinner featured a host who served a whole roasted pig stuffed with live thrushes that flew out when carved, courses served on dishes worth more than houses, and entertainment that included gladiator fights during the appetizers. The problem was, other Romans read his descriptions and thought, "That sounds amazing. We should do that." So Petronius accidentally became the inspiration for the very behavior he was mocking. It's like writing a parody of influencer culture and then watching everyone try to recreate your joke posts seriously. Eventually, Nero got jealous of Petronius's reputation and forced him to commit suicide. Apparently, Even in ancient Rome, being too good at parties could be a death sentence. And if you think that's peak Roman absurdity, wait until you hear about what happened when emperors themselves started throwing parties. This wasn't just about rich people behaving badly at dinner. Roman banquets were where political alliances were formed, business deals were struck, and social hierarchies were reinforced through increasingly elaborate displays of wealth and power. Who you invited, where they sat, what you served them, and how much you spent could make or break careers, determine military appointments, and even influence imperial succession. The competition to throw the most memorable party became so intense that it literally bankrupted noble families. People would sell land, borrow money from loan sharks, and even mortgage their children's futures just to afford one night of spectacular excess. It wasn't uncommon for a single dinner party to cost more than building a small town, and the pressure to keep up with social expectations drove some of Rome's most prominent citizens to financial ruin. Meanwhile, this absurd display of wealth was happening while most Romans lived in cramped apartment buildings and survived on bread and cheap wine. The disconnect between the elite's party culture and everyday Roman life would eventually contribute to the empire's social instability and economic problems. The Petronius and his satirical dinner parties were just the beginning. The real madness started when the emperors themselves decided to get involved in the party scene, turning what had been private displays of wealth into public spectacles that would make modern Vegas blush. The Roman banquet wasn't just a meal, it was performance. Art with a side of potential food poisoning. Unlike our modern dinner parties, where the biggest drama might be someone bringing store-bought dessert to a potluck, Roman banquets were carefully choreographed productions designed to demonstrate wealth, power, and complete disregard for common sense. The typical Roman feast, called a convivium, followed strict social protocols that would make modern etiquette experts weep with confusion. Guests were ranked by importance and seated accordingly on couches. Yes, couches. Because Romans thought sitting in chairs while eating was for barbarians and people who hadn't conquered half the world yet. The most important guest got the spot of honor, while lesser mortals were relegated to increasingly uncomfortable positions that basically announced their social status to everyone in the room. But here's where it gets interesting. The whole system was designed to be a delicate balance of showing off your wealth while not appearing too eager to show off your wealth. You had to demonstrate that you were so rich that throwing an absurdly expensive party was just casual Tuesday behavior for you. It was like humble bragging, except with peacock brains and entertainment that might include actual human sacrifice. The pressure to innovate meant that what started as simple dinner parties evolved into increasingly elaborate spectacles. Hosts competed to serve the most exotic foods, provide the most shocking entertainment, and create the most memorable experiences, which, given Roman standards for memorable, often meant traumatizing. We're talking about a culture where dinner and a show might literally involve gladiators fighting to the death between the fish course and the meat course. Take Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, who once threw a banquet where each course was served on dishes made from different precious metals. The appetizers came on silver, the main course on gold, and the dessert on dishes embedded with actual jewels. But that wasn't the memorable part. The memorable part was when he had slaves dressed as mythological figures reenact scenes from Homer while guests ate. Except the special effects involved real fire, real weapons, and a disappointingly high casualty rate among the entertainment. One particularly ambitious host decided to recreate the 4 seasons during a single meal. The dining room was redesigned 4 times throughout the evening. They literally moved all the furniture and redecorated. Between courses, spring featured fresh flowers and baby animals frolicking around the dining area. Summer brought in braziers and exotic fruits. Autumn included a harvest theme with grain scattered on the floor. Winter involved actual snow imported from the Alps, because apparently regular ice wasn't expensive enough. But my personal favorite has to be the dinner party thrown by a wealthy senator who decided to serve only foods that were mentioned in famous literary works. Sounds cultured, right? Except his interpretation included ambrosia, which he decided was honey mixed with ground pearls, nectar, wine mixed with liquid gold, actual gold, and various dishes inspired by mythology that probably shouldn't have been taken literally. The evening ended with half the guests suffering from what we would now recognize as heavy metal poisoning. But hey, at least it was educational. Another host, determined to outdo everyone else's exotic animal entertainment, imported a hippopotamus from Egypt, a live hippopotamus, to wander around his dining room during dinner. If you've ever seen a hippo in person, you'll understand why. This was both the most memorable and most terrifying dinner party of the season. The animal destroyed most of the furniture, terrorized the guests, and apparently ate one of the other exotic animals that was supposed to be part of the entertainment. But everyone agreed it was definitely unforgettable, which was apparently the point. Then there was the trend of surprise courses, dishes that weren't what they appeared to be. A roasted swan might actually be stuffed with live songbirds that would fly out when carved. A seemingly normal pie might contain a dwarf who would jump out and perform acrobatics. One particularly creative chef created a dish that looked like a regular roasted pig, but was actually made entirely from different types of fish, reconstructed and painted to look like pork. The amount of effort that went into these culinary pranks was absolutely staggering, and the fact that guests were expected to act surprised and delighted every time suggests that Roman dinner parties required some serious acting skills. But it wasn't that simple. While hosts were competing to throw the most extravagant parties, Roman society was simultaneously obsessed with the concept of moderation and virtue. The same culture that celebrated these ridiculous banquets also produced philosophers and moralists who constantly criticized excessive behavior. It was like having a society where everyone agreed that materialism was bad while simultaneously trying to out-materialize each other. The contradiction went deeper than just social hypocrisy. Many of the men throwing these parties were the same. One's giving speeches in the Senate about Roman values and the importance of living simply. Cato the Elder, famous for his moral strictness, once gave a speech condemning luxury and excess while wearing a toga that cost more than most people's houses. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the virtue of moderation while throwing banquets that lasted for days. Even more confusing was the way Romans tried to justify their excess through cultural and religious reasoning. They claimed that elaborate banquets honored the gods, celebrated Roman military victories, or demonstrated proper hospitality to foreign dignitaries. One host justified serving dishes made with actual gold by explaining that it showed respect for Jupiter, who obviously deserved only the finest offerings. Another claimed that his 3-day feast was actually a religious observance, despite the fact that most of the activities would have horrified any respectable deity. The religious angle was particularly absurd, because Romans were simultaneously known for being practical and pragmatic people. These were the folks who built roads, aqueducts, and legal systems that lasted for centuries. But put them in a dining room with some social pressure, and suddenly they were justifying serving wine that cost more than a small farm, because it properly honored Bacchus. The most ridiculous contradiction was how these same people would give speeches about the importance of military discipline and Roman toughness while being unable to walk to their own bathrooms without assistance because they'd eaten so much exotic food they could barely move. Roman generals, who had conquered entire nations, would spend hours debating the proper way to prepare flamingo tongues, apparently without seeing any irony in the situation. The result was a society where throwing a boring dinner Party could literally end your political career, but throwing too exciting a dinner party could also end your political career, and possibly your actual life. The pressure to find the perfect balance between impressive and not too impressive created a whole industry of professional party planners, food critics, and social consultants whose job was to help wealthy Romans navigate the increasingly complex world of competitive hospitality. The economic consequences were staggering. Entire families bankrupted themselves, trying to keep up with party expectations. The demand for exotic foods and materials created trade networks that stretched across the known world. Roman dinner parties were literally reshaping global commerce. Merchants made fortunes importing everything from Chinese silk for tablecloths to Indian spices for novelty dishes that nobody actually wanted to eat. Meanwhile, the lower classes watched this spectacle with a mixture of amazement and disgust. Roman authors wrote satirical works mocking the elite's party culture, but they also wrote detailed descriptions of these same parties, suggesting that even people who found the behavior ridiculous were fascinated by it. It was like ancient TMZ. Everyone claimed to disapprove while secretly wanting all the juicy details. The political implications were serious. Powerful Romans used these gatherings to form alliances, make deals, and sometimes eliminate rivals. More than one political career ended because someone served the wrong wine to the wrong person, or failed to properly honor a guest's seating preferences. The Emperor Caligula once had a senator executed partly because the man had thrown a party that Caligula thought was trying to upstage imperial banquets. Some emperors tried to regulate party culture through sumptuary laws, rules about how much you could spend on entertainment and food. These laws were universally ignored, partly because the emperors themselves were usually the worst offenders. It's hard to take someone's lecture about moderation seriously when they're giving it while sitting on a throne made of ivory and feeding their pet tiger exotic meats between sentences. The long-term cultural impact was that Roman party culture became the template for aristocratic excess throughout European history. Medieval nobles, Renaissance princes, and modern billionaires all basically copied Roman banquet techniques, proving that humans have been trying to out-weird each other at dinner parties for over 2,000 years. Meanwhile, while the wealthy were competing to serve the most ridiculous food combinations, the actual food itself was becoming increasingly bizarre. Roman chefs, pushed by their demanding patrons to create ever more exotic dishes, began developing cooking techniques and flavor combinations that would make modern molecular gastronomists look like conservative traditionalists. The kitchen became a laboratory where chefs experimented with ingredients that probably shouldn't have been combined, cooking methods that defied common sense, and presentation styles that prioritize shock value over actual edibility. We're talking about a culinary culture where too weird wasn't a criticism. It was a challenge to do better next time. But the food was just the opening act. The real entertainment was about to begin, and Roman party entertainment made their exotic cuisine look positively normal by comparison. When wealthy Romans decided that dinner needed a show, they didn't settle for a few musicians or maybe some dancers. They went full ramal, which meant spectacle, drama, and a casualty rate that would concern modern insurance companies. If Roman banquet hospitality was competitive performance art, then Roman party entertainment was basically what would happen. If you gave Cirque du Soleil an unlimited budget, removed all safety regulations, and told them the audience expected actual death as part of the show. Unlike modern dinner parties, where entertainment might mean someone playing acoustic, guitar, or maybe a slideshow from someone's vacation, Roman banquets featured entertainment that was specifically designed to be so memorable that guests would either never forget it or never recover from it. The Romans approached party entertainment with the same engineering mindset. They used to build their roads and aqueducts. If it wasn't completely over the top and potentially dangerous, it wasn't. worth doing. This was a culture that looked at gladiatorial combat and thought, you know what this needs? More exotic animals, and maybe some dinner service in between the death matches. Roman party entertainment evolved into three main categories: the shocking, the expensive, and the why would anyone think this was a good idea. Often, the best entertainment managed to be all three simultaneously. Hosts competed to provide experiences that were so far beyond normal human experience that their guests would spend months talking about what they'd witnessed, assuming they survived to talk about it. The entertainment industry that developed around Roman banquets was enormous. Professional entertainers, animal trainers, musicians, dancers, acrobats, and various other performers made their living providing increasingly elaborate shows for wealthy Romans who had apparently run out of normal ways to spend their money. Some entertainers became famous throughout the empire, commanding fees that were higher than military commanders' annual salaries. Because apparently, in ancient Rome, being able to juggle flaming objects while riding a trained bear was considered a more valuable skill than conquering Germanic tribes. Consider the banquet thrown by Emperor Domitian, who decided that regular entertainment wasn't dramatic enough for his dinner parties. He constructed a dining room with black walls, black floors, black ceiling, and black furniture, then served his guests on black dishes while they were entertained by performers dressed as ghosts and funeral spirits. The guests, who weren't warned about the theme, spent the entire evening convinced they were attending their own funeral banquet, which, given Domitian's reputation for executing people for minor social infractions, was a reasonable assumption. But the real genius was what happened after dinner. Each guest was escorted home by a personal slave they'd never seen before, carrying gifts they hadn't been shown. The guests spent the entire trip home wondering if these were parting gifts or if the slaves were actually assassins. It turned out to be an elaborate practical joke. The gifts were expensive presents, and the slaves were just regular servants. But several guests reportedly needed medical attention for stress-related conditions. At least one supposedly never recovered from the psychological trauma. Then there was the trend of interactive dining that developed during the early empire. One particularly creative host decided that his guests should hunt their own dinner. He released various exotic animals throughout his villa and handed out hunting weapons to his guests, expecting them to catch and kill their own food while maintaining dinner party conversation. The evening devolved into chaos when a group of wealthy senators, who had probably never held weapons more dangerous than styluses, attempted to corner a wild boar in the atrium. The boar won. Several guests required medical attention. The host's expensive marble statuary was destroyed, and the boar apparently made its escape through the villa's front entrance, terrorizing the neighborhood for days afterward. But everyone agreed it was the most exciting dinner party of the season, so naturally, other hosts started copying the concept. Another memorable entertainment innovation was the surprise gladiator match, where hosts would hire professional gladiators to stage fights during dinner, except the guests weren't told whether the combat was real or staged. The psychological tension of watching two people fight to the death while trying to enjoy your roasted peacock was apparently considered the height of sophisticated entertainment. One host took this concept even further by staging a mock battle, using his dinner guests as unwilling participants. Midway through the meal, actors dressed as Germanic warriors invaded the dining room, captured the guests, and forced them to participate in a reenactment of a recent Roman military victory. The guests, most of whom were wealthy Romans with no military experience, were given weapons and expected to fight for their freedom while maintaining proper dinner party etiquette. The evening ended with several genuine injuries. One guest suffering what we would now recognize as a panic attack, and the host's villa suffering significant property damage. But the host was so pleased with the innovation, that he immediately began planning an even more elaborate version for his next party, this time featuring real animals and more realistic weapons. Perhaps the most bizarre entertainment trend was competitive vomiting. Roman banquets often lasted for hours and included multiple courses, so guests developed the practice of deliberately vomiting between courses to make room for more food. What started as a practical necessity evolved into entertainment, with some hosts providing elaborate vomitoriums, special rooms designed for the purpose, and even hiring professional vomiting instructors to teach proper technique. The competition aspect developed when hosts began judging guests on their vomiting style, speed, and recovery time. Some guests became famous throughout Roman high society for their superior vomiting abilities. There were apparently technique debates, training regimens, and even professional rivalry between guests who took pride in their digestive management skills. It was like competitive eating, except in reverse, and somehow even more disturbing. This wasn't isolated behavior. There was a clear pattern in how Roman entertainment escalated over time. What started as musicians and dancers evolved into increasingly elaborate spectacles that prioritize shock value over safety, expense over enjoyment, and memorability over basic human decency. The pattern followed a predictable cycle. Someone would introduce a new type of entertainment. Other hosts would copy it. Then someone would try to top it with a more extreme version, leading to an arms race of absurdity that continued until either someone died or the authorities intervened. Then the cycle would start over with a different type of entertainment. This pattern existed because Roman social hierarchy was based on outdoing your peers, and party entertainment was one of the most visible ways to demonstrate your superiority. If your neighbor hired a few musicians, you hired an entire orchestra. If they had dancers, you had acrobats. If they had acrobats, you had acrobats performing over a pit of wild animals. The logical endpoint of this competition was entertainment that was so extreme it was essentially performance art meets extreme sports meets psychological torture. Why this pattern existed goes back to Roman values and social structure. Romans were competitive by nature. Their entire culture was built around conquest, achievement, and public recognition. When you take that competitive instinct and combine it with unlimited wealth and no real regulatory oversight, you get party entertainment. That treats human life as a disposable commodity in service of creating memorable experiences. The social and economic factors that supported this pattern were complex. Rome's military conquests provided both the wealth to fund these spectacles and a steady supply of slaves, prisoners, and exotic animals to serve as entertainment. The city's population included people from across the known world, many of whom brought their own cultural traditions of performance and spectacle. Compared to other ancient civilizations, Roman party entertainment was uniquely extreme. Greeks had symposiums with philosophical discussions and moderate drinking. Egyptians had religious festivals with ceremonial significance. Romans had dinner parties where the entertainment might literally kill you, and that was considered a feature, not a bug. The effects were far-reaching and mostly disturbing. The wealthy Roman elite became increasingly disconnected from reality, living in a world where normal human experiences weren't exciting enough to hold their attention. This created a culture where extreme behavior was normalized. Violence was. Entertainment and human life was valued primarily for its shock potential. Who benefited? Professional entertainers could make enormous amounts of money, assuming they survived their performances. Exotic animal traders, weapons manufacturers, and various luxury goods providers all profited from the demand for increasingly elaborate party supplies. The construction industry boomed as wealthy Romans renovated their homes to accommodate more extreme entertainment concepts, but far more people suffered. Slaves were used as disposable entertainment, often dying for the amusement of dinner guests. Wild animals were captured, transported, and killed for novelty value. The economic resources spent on party entertainment could have built cities, funded infrastructure projects, or supported thousands of families. Instead, they were literally consumed for a few hours of amusement. The unintended consequences were significant. The normalization of extreme violence as entertainment contributed to the general brutalization of Roman society. When watching people die for amusement was considered sophisticated dinner party entertainment, it became easier to justify violence. In other contexts, the empire's later problems with civil wars, political assassinations, and general social instability can be partially traced to this cultural acceptance of violence as a solution to boredom. How this shaped future developments is crucial to understanding Roman history. The entertainment industry that developed around private banquets eventually influenced public spectacles like gladiatorial games and public executions. The techniques for managing crowds, staging dramatic events, and manipulating public emotions were refined in wealthy Romans' dining rooms before being scaled up for political purposes. Modern parallels are uncomfortably obvious. Wealthy people competing to throw the most extravagant parties, entertainment that prioritizes shock value over artistic merit, and the treatment of violence as a form of amusement are all familiar patterns. The main difference is that modern regulations and social norms place some limits on how extreme these behaviors can become, though those limits are constantly being tested. The lessons for contemporary issues are clear. When a society allows wealth to become completely disconnected from social responsibility, when competition for status becomes more important than basic human decency, and when entertainment culture normalizes extreme behavior, the results are predictably destructive. Roman party entertainment was essentially what happens when you give people unlimited resources and no moral constraints. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries, even in private settings. Yet even as Roman party entertainment was reaching these peaks of elaborate insanity, the food culture itself was undergoing its own transformation into something that would make modern, competitive eating contests look like gentle tea parties. Roman chefs, competing to create dishes worthy of these extreme entertainment spectacles, began developing culinary techniques that prioritized novelty and expense over basic concepts, like edibility and not poisoning the guests. The kitchen became a laboratory for culinary experiments that often defied common sense, basic chemistry, and occasionally the laws of physics. We're talking about a food culture where the primary question wasn't, "Does this taste good?" but rather, "Will this make our guests question everything they thought they knew about food?" Roman cuisine evolved into something that was part cooking, part chemistry experiment, and part elaborate practical joke played on people's digestive systems. But food was just one part of the larger culture of competitive excess that was beginning to consume Roman society like a particularly expensive and inefficient parasite. The real drama was about to unfold when emperors themselves decided to get directly involved in the party scene. By the time the early Roman emperors decided to get personally involved in the party scene, the situation had reached a breaking point that would make modern event planners require therapy. The competitive party culture that had been escalating among wealthy Romans for decades suddenly had access to the entire imperial treasury, unlimited governmental resources, and leaders who had been raised to believe that normal human limitations didn't apply to them. The key players involved included some of history's most notorious figures. Caligula, who thought horses made better dinner guests than senators. Nero, who believed every party needed a musical performance by himself. And Elagabalus, who managed to make both Caligula and Nero look like models of restraint and good judgment. These weren't just wealthy private citizens trying to impress their neighbors. These were rulers of the known world with the power to commandeer entire provinces to supply their dinner parties. The stakes involved were enormous. Imperial banquets weren't just social events. They were political statements that demonstrated the emperor's power, wealth, and complete disconnect from reality to foreign dignitaries, military commanders, and potential rivals. A successful imperial party could strengthen political alliances and intimidate enemies. A failed one could spark rebellions, military coups, or Senate conspiracies. But here's where things got truly dangerous. These emperors were competing not just with each other's legacies, but with the growing expectations of Roman society itself. Citizens had become accustomed to increasingly spectacular public games and festivals, so imperial private parties had to be even more extreme to maintain the emperor's reputation for magnificence. It was like an arms race, except instead of nuclear weapons, they were competing with increasingly ridiculous dinner parties. The pressure created a perfect storm, where unlimited power met unlimited wealth and unlimited ego, all focused on the single goal of throwing parties so memorable that they would be talked about for centuries. Unfortunately, they succeeded, just not necessarily in the way they intended. Enter Caligula's most infamous banquet, the dinner party that essentially broke the Roman imperial system's credibility for a generation. The event was supposedly held to celebrate a military victory that never actually happened. Caligula had declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, and claimed victory after his soldiers collected seashells as spoils of war. This should have been everyone's first clue that the evening might not go according to normal party planning protocols. The guest list included senators, foreign ambassadors, military commanders, and Caligula's horse, Incitatus, who was seated at the head table wearing a collar made of precious stones and apparently expected to participate in dinner conversation. Guests were instructed to address the horse with the same respect they would show the emperor himself, which created the surreal situation of Rome's most powerful men making small talk with a horse while pretending this was perfectly normal behavior. But that was just the appetizer course of insanity. Caligula had decided that regular entertainment wasn't imperial enough, so he arranged for a staged naval battle to be performed in his dining room. Yes, in his dining room. Slaves dressed as rival naval forces were forced to fight with actual weapons in a specially constructed pool, while guests tried to eat around the splashing water and occasional screaming. The battle quickly devolved into actual combat when the slaves, apparently deciding they had nothing to lose, began fighting for real. Guests found themselves dodging arrows and spear points while trying to maintain polite dinner conversation. Several senators were struck by projectiles. One ambassador was knocked into the water feature, and at least 3 people required medical attention for what were politely described as entertainment-related injuries. Caligula's response to this chaos was to declare it the most successful party entertainment ever and immediately demand an encore performance. The second naval battle was even more chaotic than the first, partly because the surviving slaves from the first battle were now genuinely angry, and partly because Caligula had decided to participate personally, commanding one of the fleets while wearing a costume that he claimed made him look like Neptune. The evening reached its climax when Caligula, apparently dissatisfied with the level of realism in his naval battle, decided to flood additional sections of the palace to create a more authentic maritime environment. Guests found themselves wading through ankle-deep water while slaves fought around them and the emperor shouted naval commands that made no tactical sense. But the truly memorable moment came when Caligula, midway through commanding his imaginary fleet, suddenly declared that one of his dinner guests was actually a spy for Neptune and ordered his immediate execution. The guest in question was a respected senator who had simply made the mistake of commenting that the naval battle was getting a bit wet for his taste. The execution was carried out immediately during dinner, with the other guests expected to continue eating while the senator was dragged away. His screams could be heard from the dining room, which Caligula claimed added authentic battle atmosphere to the entertainment. Guests continued making polite conversation about the weather and recent chariot races while pretending not to notice that someone had just been murdered for criticizing the party decorations. The evening concluded with Caligula promoting his horse to consul, a position equivalent to being second in command of the empire, and announcing that Incitatus would be hosting the next imperial banquet. Guests were expected to congratulate the horse on its appointment and discuss policy matters with it, as they would any other high-ranking official. The immediate aftermath involved several guests requiring medical treatment, one ambassador requesting immediate transfer back to his home country, citing irreconcilable cultural differences, and at least 2 senators reportedly never attending another imperial function. The palace staff spent days cleaning up water damage, blood stains, and what the official records diplomatically described as various entertainment-related debris. The response was a mixture of terror, confusion, and desperate attempts to pretend that what everyone had witnessed was perfectly normal imperial behavior. Public reaction ranged from horrified silence to nervous laughter, with most Romans adopting the survival strategy of agreeing that yes, it had certainly been a memorable evening, and wasn't the emperor wonderfully creative in his party planning? That there had certainly been a memorable evening, and wasn't the emperor wonderfully creative in his party planning? Senate's immediate response was to send a formal letter thanking Caligula for the educational and entertaining evening, while privately beginning to discuss whether there were any legal precedents for removing an emperor who had clearly lost his mind. Several senators started making discreet inquiries about early retirement opportunities in distant provinces, preferably ones without navigable waterways that might remind Caligula of his naval victories. Foreign ambassadors sent reports back to their home countries that were so bizarre their own governments initially assumed they were written in some kind of diplomatic code. The Egyptian ambassador's report, which survived in historical records, includes the phrase, "The horse has been promoted and appears to be forming policy opinions," which his pharaoh apparently spent weeks trying to decipher before realizing it was meant literally. Military commanders began developing contingency plans for various scenarios, including what to do if the emperor declares war on other mythological figures, and appropriate protocol for receiving military orders from livestock. The Praetorian Guard, responsible for imperial security, found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to protect an emperor who might be more dangerous to himself than any external threat. The long-term political fallout was severe. Caligula's behavior at imperial banquets became evidence for his growing political opposition that the emperor was unfit to rule. The combination of extreme spending on party entertainment, erratic behavior toward important political figures, and the general sense that Roman dignity was being compromised for the sake of dinner party novelties contributed to the conspiracy that eventually led to his assassination. The economic consequences were also significant. The cost of Caligula's parties, combined with his other extravagant projects, began to strain even the imperial treasury. Resources that could have funded military campaigns, infrastructure projects, or social programs were instead spent on increasingly elaborate entertainment that served no purpose beyond satisfying the emperor's need for attention. Most importantly, Caligula's banquets established a precedent that imperial parties were events where normal rules of law, social behavior, and basic human decency didn't apply. This created expectations for future emperors to match or exceed this level of extravagance, leading to an escalating cycle of imperial party madness that would plague the empire for generations. This wasn't just about one emperor's psychological problems or a particularly bad dinner party. Caligula's banquet represented the logical endpoint of a system where unlimited power met a culture that had already normalized extreme behavior as entertainment. When a society accepts that wealth and status justify treating human life as disposable amusement, it becomes inevitable that someone with unlimited wealth and status will take that principle to its ultimate conclusion. What this revealed about the Roman system was deeply troubling. The imperial structure had concentrated so much power in a single person that there were no effective checks on an emperor's behavior, even when that behavior was clearly destructive. The Senate, military, and other governmental institutions were so dependent on imperial approval that they couldn't effectively oppose even obviously insane policies. The broader cultural implications were equally significant. Roman society had become so focused on spectacle and competition that they had lost the ability to distinguish between impressive and destructive behavior. The same culture that produced great engineering, legal systems, and military innovations had also created a social environment where murdering dinner guests was considered creative entertainment. Long-term effects on the empire included the establishment of imperial party culture as a political institution. Future emperors felt pressure to match or exceed their predecessors' extravagance, creating a cycle where each generation had to be more extreme than the last. This diverted enormous resources from productive uses and contributed to the general sense that the imperial system was becoming disconnected from practical governance. Why historians still debate Caligula's banquets is because they represent a perfect case study of how power corrupts not just individuals, but entire social systems. The fact that so many people went along with obviously insane behavior because it was coming from someone with authority remains a relevant lesson for understanding how civilizations can destroy themselves through their own success. Around the main imperial madness, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in making Roman party culture the sophisticated nightmare it became. These weren't just background players. They were the specialists, innovators, and opportunists who turned party planning into an entire industry dedicated to enabling wealthy Romans. Increasingly creative mental breakdowns. First up is Marcus Gavius Apicius, the ancient world's first celebrity chef and a man so obsessed with expensive food that he literally ate himself into bankruptcy. Apicius wasn't just a cook. He was a culinary innovator who elevated Roman cuisine from food that keeps you alive to food that might kill you, but expensively. He wrote the world's first surviving cookbook, which reads less like recipes and more like a guide to financial suicide through gourmet ingredients. Apicius was famous for spending enormous sums on single meals, including one dinner party where he served flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and a sauce made from fish that had been fed nothing but figs for their entire lives. He once spent what would be equivalent to millions of modern dollars to import snow from mountains just to chill his wine properly. When he finally calculated that he only had about 10 million sesterces left, still enough to live comfortably for several lifetimes, he poisoned himself rather than face the horror of eating normal food like a common person. The irony is that Apicius died wealthy by any reasonable standard, but poor by the standards of Roman party culture. His suicide note reportedly complained that he couldn't afford to maintain his lifestyle, which gives you some idea of how disconnected from reality Roman food culture had become. Next is Locusta, the professional poisoner who became the most trusted party planner in Rome, though her parties had a significantly higher mortality rate than most. Locusta wasn't officially a party planner. She was the empire's go-to expert for eliminating people inconspicuously. But her services were so in demand among wealthy Romans that she essentially became a party consultant, advising hosts on how to remove unwanted guests permanently while maintaining plausible deniability. Her client list included emperors Claudius and Nero, plus dozens of wealthy Romans who had discovered that murder was often more efficient than social ostracism for dealing with party guests who didn't appreciate their hospitality properly. Locusta developed specialized techniques for different social situations, quick-acting poisons for guests who overstayed their welcome, slow-acting ones for building dramatic tension during dinner, and her signature delayed reaction formula that wouldn't take effect until the victim had left the party, providing perfect alibi opportunities. Not the fact that Romans needed a professional poisoner on speed dial for their dinner parties tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they took their social obligations. Then there's Paris, the famous pantomime actor who became the empire's most expensive party entertainment. Paris wasn't just a performer. He was essentially the ancient world's first celebrity influencer, with wealthy Romans competing to book him for their parties, the way modern billionaires compete for exclusive concert performances. Paris specialized in dramatic performances that combined dance, acting, and what would now be called interpretive gymnastics. His performances were so popular that fights broke out among audience members over his artistic choices, and his personal life was followed more closely than modern tabloid celebrities. Multiple emperors were rumored to have affairs with him. Several wealthy women bankrupted themselves trying to win his attention, and at least one senator allegedly committed suicide when Paris refused to perform at his party. The cultural power Paris wielded was extraordinary. His approval could make a party the social event of the season, while his disapproval could destroy a host's reputation permanently. He essentially became a one-man arbitrator of Roman social status, which is probably not a responsibility that should be given to someone whose primary skill is dancing dramatically while wearing elaborate costumes. What makes these characters fascinating is how they represent the professionalization of Roman excess. These weren't just wealthy people behaving badly. They were specialists who turned bad behavior into an art form with its own techniques, standards, and career advancement opportunities. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across the empire. The world of Roman party culture was a tightly connected network where everyone knew everyone else's business, and one person's party disaster could become another person's opportunity for social advancement or spectacular failure. The relationships were complex and often ridiculous. Apicius and Locusta, for example, had a professional rivalry that bordered on open warfare. Apicius resented that Locusta's poisoning services were more in demand than his culinary innovations, while Locusta was reportedly offended that people considered her work, cooking, rather than recognizing it as a sophisticated chemical art form. Their feud culminated in a dinner party, where Apicius attempted to serve a dish so exotic and expensive that it would overshadow Locusta's reputation, while Locusta supposedly attempted to poison Apicius's signature sauce as a professional insult. Evening ended with several guests becoming violently ill, though whether this was due to Apicius's experimental cooking or Locusta's interference remained a matter of heated debate in Roman high society for months afterward. Both claimed credit for the memorable experience, which tells you something about Roman party standards. Political networks were equally interconnected and absurd. Paris, the pantomime dancer, became a power broker precisely because he performed at so many important parties. He knew which senators were having affairs, which military commanders were plotting against each other, and which wealthy families were facing financial ruin from their party expenses. This information made him valuable to politicians who wanted intelligence about their rivals, which meant that booking Paris for your party wasn't just about entertainment. It was about gaining access to Rome's unofficial intelligence network. The social webs were even more complex. Wealthy Romans who wanted to throw successful parties needed to maintain relationships with exotic animal suppliers, professional entertainers, specialty food importers, and various other service providers who formed their own interconnected community. These suppliers often knew more about their clients' financial situations than the client's own accountants, since party expenses were often the largest items in wealthy Romans' budgets. One famous case involved a wealthy senator who discovered that his exotic animal supplier was also providing information about his spending habits to his political rivals. who were using this intelligence to time their own party schedules to maximum advantage. The resulting scandal involved accusations of commercial espionage, breach of party planning ethics, and unfair competitive entertainment practices. Apparently, even in ancient Rome, people took their party politics seriously. How one event led to another created cascading effects throughout Roman society. When one host introduced a new type of entertainment, other hosts felt pressured to copy or improve upon it. But the supply chains for exotic party materials were limited, so increased demand often led to shortages, price inflation, and sometimes international incidents when Roman party planners' needs conflicted with diplomatic relationships. The famous Great Peacock Crisis of 47 CE occurred when multiple wealthy Romans simultaneously decided the peacock-based cuisine was essential for their upcoming parties. The demand was so high that it created a peacock shortage throughout the Mediterranean, leading to dramatic price increases, black market peacock trafficking, and at least one military expedition that was officially described as a diplomatic mission, but was actually launched to secure peacock supplies for imperial banquets. Unintended consequences and connections were everywhere. The professional entertainment industry that developed around Roman parties created its own social hierarchy, with star performers wielding significant political influence. The exotic food trade reshaped Mediterranean commerce with entire regions, specializing in producing luxury items for Roman party consumption. The architectural modifications needed to accommodate increasingly elaborate party entertainment influenced Roman building techniques and urban planning. Most absurdly, the party culture created its own diplomatic protocols. Foreign ambassadors had to be briefed on proper behavior at Roman parties, including how to react appropriately to various forms of extreme entertainment, and how to interpret different types of hospitality as political messages. Several international incidents were caused by ambassadors who misunderstood the social significance of Roman party customs, leading to situations where military alliances were threatened because someone didn't properly appreciate a host's innovative vomiting facilities. To understand how Roman party culture reached such spectacular heights of absurdity, you have to understand that Romans lived in a society where competitive excess was not just accepted, but actively encouraged as a demonstration of civic virtue. This wasn't a culture that valued moderation or understated elegance. This was a civilization built on the principle that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing so dramatically that neighboring countries would hear about it and be appropriately intimidated. Daily life for wealthy Romans was already pretty excessive by modern standards. These were people who heated their floors, had running water in multiple rooms, owned dozens of slaves, and considered a day without a hot bath to be a sign of either poverty or barbarian influence. Their baseline for normal living was already so high that party entertainment had to be truly extreme to register as special. Roman beliefs and attitudes were shaped by a culture that worshipped gods, who were themselves notorious for excessive behavior. Jupiter threw lightning bolts when annoyed. Bacchus promoted drinking to the point of temporary insanity, and Mars solved problems through violence. When your religious pantheon consists entirely of deities with anger management issues and substance abuse problems, it's not surprising that their worshippers developed similar approaches to conflict resolution and recreational activities. Social structures reinforced these attitudes through the patron-client system, where wealthy Romans were expected to demonstrate their success through generous hospitality to their social dependents. But generous hospitality, in Roman terms, meant providing entertainment that was memorable enough to justify your clients' loyalty and impressive enough to attract new clients from your rival social networks. What was considered normal versus exceptional had become completely skewed. Normal dinner parties featured multiple courses of exotic foods, professional entertainment, and enough wine to incapacitate a small army. Exceptional parties required entertainment that bordered on performance. Art, food that cost more than most people's annual income, and experiences that guests would remember for the rest of their lives. Assuming they survived the experience, the competitive aspect was built into Roman social DNA. This was a culture where everything was a contest. Military campaigns, political careers, architectural projects, and even poetry competitions could result in exile or execution for the losers. When that competitive mindset was applied to party planning, it created an arms race where each host tried to outdo their predecessors through increasingly creative interpretations of what constituted appropriate hospitality. Romans also had a complex relationship with luxury that combined guilt and obsession in equal measure. They simultaneously celebrated and condemned excessive behavior, which created a culture where people felt obligated to throw elaborate parties while also complaining about other people's elaborate parties. This cognitive dissonance meant that party culture could continue escalating without anyone feeling responsible for the escalation. Perhaps most ironic was how the same Romans, who gave speeches about the importance of military discipline and civic virtue, were completely incapable of exercising basic self-control when it came to party planning. Senators who could debate complex legal issues for hours would spend days arguing about the proper way to serve peacock brains, apparently without seeing any contradiction between their intellectual capabilities and their dinner party obsessions. The contradictions were everywhere. Romans prided themselves on being practical, engineering-minded people who built roads and aqueducts that lasted for centuries. Yet they also spent enormous resources on parties that lasted for a few hours and were forgotten within months. They valued efficiency and military precision in public life, while accepting complete chaos and waste as normal in private entertainment. Religious contradictions were particularly absurd. Romans claimed their party culture honored the gods, despite the fact that most of their party behavior would have horrified any respectable deity. They held elaborate banquets to celebrate military victories while engaging in entertainment that would have been considered undisciplined and unmilitary by their own army standards. The social contradictions were equally ridiculous. The same culture that produced great philosophers and legal scholars also normalized murder as dinner entertainment. Romans who could write sophisticated poetry about love and honor spent their evenings watching people die for amusement while discussing the weather. Most absurd of all were the economic contradictions. Romans complained constantly about the cost of maintaining their lifestyles while simultaneously competing to spend more money than their neighbors on increasingly pointless party innovations. They developed complex financial instruments and trade networks to support their economy, then used those same systems to fund entertainment that contributed nothing to economic productivity. The gender contradictions were also significant. Roman women were expected to be modest and domestic, yet the most successful hostesses were those who could plan parties featuring extreme violence and exotic entertainment. The same society that restricted women's legal rights celebrated them when they demonstrated creativity in organizing events that shocked even Romans' high tolerance for shocking behavior. Modern parallels to these contradictions are uncomfortably obvious and probably don't need to be spelled out in detail. Everything changed when Emperor Marcus Aurelius came to power in 161 CE and did something completely unprecedented in Roman imperial history. He threw boring dinner parties, not just moderately restrained gatherings or slightly less extreme banquets. Actual, genuinely boring dinner parties where guests ate normal food, engaged in philosophical discussions, and went home at reasonable hours without requiring medical attention or psychological counseling. The background to this dramatic shift wasn't just one emperor's personal preferences. By the mid-2nd century CE, The Roman Empire was facing serious financial pressure from constant military campaigns, infrastructure maintenance, and the growing cost of maintaining an imperial system that had become addicted to spectacular excess. The treasury was being drained by everything from frontier wars to the emperor's predecessor's party expenses, and someone finally had to ask the uncomfortable question: maybe we should stop spending more on dinner entertainment than most provinces. Generating tax revenue? Marcus Aurelius, being a philosopher emperor who actually took Stoic principles seriously, looked at the imperial party culture and apparently thought, this is completely insane. He implemented what amounted to imperial party reform, establishing entertainment budgets, limiting guest lists, and, most shocking of all, serving food that was intended primarily for nutrition rather than showing off. The key factors that led to this transformation were both practical and philosophical. Practically, the empire simply couldn't afford to continue the escalating party arms race that had been consuming imperial resources for generations. The cost of maintaining exotic animal collections, hiring professional entertainers, and importing luxury ingredients had become a significant drain on the imperial budget at a time when the empire needed those resources for actual governance. Philosophically, Marcus Aurelius represented a return to older Roman values that emphasized duty, moderation, and public service over personal gratification and social competition. His Stoic philosophy viewed the kind of excessive behavior that had characterized imperial parties as fundamentally corrupting to both individual character and social order. But perhaps most importantly, this moment was different because Marcus Aurelius had the political authority and personal conviction to actually enforce change. Previous emperors who had briefly attempted to moderate party culture had either given up when faced with social pressure or been overthrown by people who preferred their leaders to be more entertainingly insane. The shift wasn't just about imperial parties. It represented a broader cultural moment when Roman society began to question whether their pursuit of increasingly extreme entertainment was actually making them happier or just more demanding and harder to satisfy. Some Romans were beginning to notice that countries that spent less time murdering people for dinner entertainment seemed to be doing just fine economically and militarily, which raised uncomfortable questions about Roman priorities. This was the beginning of what historians call the Antonine Pause, a period when Roman culture briefly stepped back from the competitive excess that had defined the empire's social life and attempted to return to more sustainable forms of entertainment that didn't require constant innovation in human suffering. The process of changing Roman party culture was like trying to convince a society of adrenaline junkies that maybe they should try meditation instead. Technically possible, but requiring significant adjustment of expectations and social norms. Marcus Aurelius didn't just announce new party policies and expect everyone to comply. He had to systematically dismantle an entire entertainment industry while providing alternative forms of social interaction that wouldn't cause wealthy Romans to die of boredom. Resistance to change was immediate and intense. Wealthy Romans who had built their social status around throwing increasingly elaborate parties suddenly found themselves facing the prospect of having to develop actual personalities and conversational skills. Professional entertainers who had made careers out of providing shocking spectacles for jaded aristocrats faced unemployment unless they could adapt to providing what? Educational lectures? Poetry readings? The horror. The resistance took several forms. Some wealthy Romans simply ignored the imperial guidelines and continued throwing elaborate parties, reasoning that Marcus Aurelius was too busy with philosophy and frontier wars to monitor everyone's dinner entertainment. This led to a bizarre period where party planning became a form of political resistance, with elaborate banquets serving as subtle protests against imperial moderation policies. Other Romans attempted to find loopholes in the new restrictions. If the emperor wanted parties focused on intellectual improvement rather than sensory overload, fine, they would throw intellectually themed parties. This resulted in dinner gatherings featuring competitive philosophy debates with wine-drunk senators arguing about metaphysics while wearing togas decorated with philosophical symbols. It was still ridiculous, but at least it was educational ridiculous. Champions of change emerged from unexpected quarters. Some Romans discovered that they actually preferred conversation-based entertainment to watching people die during dinner. Military commanders, in particular, appreciated parties where they could discuss strategy and politics without having to dodge random projectiles from arena-style entertainment. Even some former party industry professionals found new careers in organizing discussion groups and educational events. The specific steps Marcus Aurelius took were methodical and comprehensive. He established imperial entertainment guidelines that specified maximum spending limits, required advance approval for certain types of performances, and mandated that imperial parties include educational or culturally beneficial elements. He personally modeled the new party style by hosting gatherings focused on philosophical discussion, poetry readings, and revolutionary concept, actual conversation between guests. More importantly, he redirected imperial resources toward public entertainment that served educational and cultural purposes, rather than just satisfying wealthy Romans' need for novelty. Public libraries, educational lectures, and cultural festivals received funding that had previously gone to importing exotic animals and hiring professional murderers for dinner entertainment. Obstacles encountered were significant. The entertainment industry that had developed around Roman party culture employed thousands of people, from exotic animal trainers to specialty food preparers to various performers, whose skills were highly specialized and not easily transferable to other careers. The economic disruption of reforming party culture created unemployment and business failures throughout the empire. Social obstacles were even more challenging. Romans had become so accustomed to extreme entertainment that normal social interaction seemed boring by comparison. People who had spent years watching gladiator fights during dinner found philosophical discussions inadequately stimulating. The adjustment period involved a lot of confused wealthy Romans wondering what they were supposed to do with their time if they weren't planning increasingly elaborate ways to shock their dinner guests. Breakthrough moments came when some influential Romans discovered that intellectual entertainment could be just as competitive as physical spectacle. Philosophy debates became social events where participants could demonstrate their wit and education rather than their budget and tolerance for violence. Poetry competitions provided opportunities for artistic achievement that didn't require importing endangered species or hiring professional assassins. The role of individuals versus larger forces was complex. While Marcus Aurelius provided imperial leadership for change, the shift also reflected broader economic and social pressures that had been building throughout the empire. The cost of maintaining extreme party culture was becoming unsustainable, and social critics had been pointing out the contradictions between Roman values and Roman party behavior for decades. Some changes happened organically as Romans became exhausted by the constant pressure to escalate their entertainment standards. There's only so many times you can watch people die during dinner before it stops being shocking and starts being monotonous. The culture had reached a point where even extreme behavior was becoming predictable and boring, which created an opening for alternative forms of entertainment. The transformation wasn't complete or permanent, but it represented a significant shift in how Romans thought about the relationship between wealth, power, and social responsibility. For the first time in generations, some Romans began to question whether their party culture was actually an achievement worth celebrating or just an expansive form of collective mental illness. The new Roman party culture under Marcus Aurelius was like stepping into an alternate universe where wealthy people used their resources for something other than competing to see who could waste money in the most creative ways. Suddenly, imperial banquets featured actual food that was intended to be eaten rather than admired, conversations that didn't require medical disclaimers, and entertainment that left guests with enhanced knowledge rather than trauma. The differences were dramatic and initially disorienting for Romans accustomed to party culture as extreme sport. Guests actually sat in chairs instead of reclining on couches, suggesting that Romans were expected to remain conscious and upright throughout the evening. Dinners had fixed ending times, eliminating the traditional Roman party experience of continuing until either everyone passed out or the entertainment budget was exhausted. Most shocking of all, the new imperial parties featured educational components. Philosophical lectures were presented between courses, with guest speakers discussing Stoic principles, natural philosophy, and practical ethics. Poetry readings replaced gladiator matches as dinner entertainment. Mathematical demonstrations and engineering discussions became acceptable topics for party conversation. Who won and who lost in this transformation was clear-cut. Military commanders and government administrators benefited enormously from parties where they could actually discuss policy issues and strategic planning without having to shout over arena combat or dodge flying exotic birds. Intellectuals and educators suddenly found themselves in demand as party entertainment, replacing the previous generation of professional performers whose primary skills involved surviving various forms of staged violence. The entertainment industry suffered massive disruption. Gladiator trainers, exotic animal suppliers, and specialty food importers found their services no longer in demand for imperial events. Professional poisoners faced unemployment, though some successfully transitioned to careers in pharmacy and medicine. Architects who specialized in designing dining rooms that could accommodate naval battles or wild animal performances had to retrain for more conventional construction projects. New rules and norms emerged around the concept of productive entertainment. Social activities that served educational, cultural, or practical purposes rather than just providing sensory overload. Parties were expected to contribute to guests' intellectual development or professional advancement. Conversations were supposed to be substantive rather than just gossip about whose party had featured the most creative forms of violence. Social status began to shift from being based on how much money you could waste on party entertainment to being based on how effectively you could contribute to intellectual and cultural discussions. Romans who had built their reputations on throwing the most expensive parties found themselves struggling in social environments where the currency was knowledge and wit rather than budget, and tolerance for extreme behavior. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed interesting aspects of Roman character. The competitive element remained. Romans still wanted to outdo each other, but now they competed over who could host the most intellectually stimulating discussion or provide the most insightful philosophical commentary. The desire for social recognition persisted, but the methods for achieving it shifted toward activities that didn't require constant innovation in human suffering. The most significant change was that Roman party culture became sustainable for the first time in generations. Parties could be repeated without requiring increasingly extreme variations. Conversations could be enjoyed without risking permanent psychological damage. And social advancement became possible without bankrupting yourself through entertainment expenses. It was like Romans had discovered that they could actually enjoy themselves without someone dying in the process, a revolutionary concept that took some adjustment. Was this change positive for Roman society? From most reasonable perspectives, absolutely. A culture where people could socialize without requiring emergency medical services represented clear progress in civilizational development. The economic benefits alone were substantial. with resources redirected from competitive entertainment waste toward infrastructure, education, and actual governance. Military efficiency improved when commanders could attend social gatherings without worrying about surviving the entertainment. But different perspectives existed even within Roman society. Some wealthy Romans genuinely mourned the loss of extreme party culture, arguing that intellectual entertainment was boring and that the empire was becoming soft and unmilitary. Veterans of the party scene complained that philosophical discussions lacked the excitement and unpredictability that had made social gatherings worth attending. Contemporary Romans who supported the changes appreciated finally being able to attend parties without requiring personal bodyguards or pre-event medical consultations. Government administrators praised the improved efficiency of policy discussions when they weren't interrupted by gladiator matches. Foreign ambassadors reported that Roman diplomatic events had become significantly less traumatic and more conducive to actual international relations. Short-term effects included immediate cost savings for the imperial treasury, reduced casualties among party guests, and increased emphasis on education and intellectual development among the Roman elite. The entertainment industry experienced significant disruption, but some performers successfully adapted to providing educational rather than shock-based entertainment. Long-term effects were more complex. The shift toward intellectual party culture contributed to what historians call the Antonine Renaissance, a period of increased literary and philosophical production. However, it also may have contributed to the empire becoming less militarily aggressive, which had both positive and negative consequences for Roman expansion and defense. Modern judgment tends to view Marcus Aurelius's party reforms as obviously beneficial, while contemporary Roman opinion was more divided. The fundamental question was whether a civilization built on conquest and competition could successfully transition to valuing intellectual achievement over physical dominance, a question that remains relevant for understanding how societies changed their core values in the years following Marcus Aurelius's death in 180 CE. Roman party culture went through what can only be described as the world's first recorded case of collective cultural whiplash. His son Commodus took one look at his father's boring philosophical dinner parties and apparently decided that what the empire really needed was a return to the good old days when party entertainment involved actual mortal combat and the possibility of guests not surviving dessert. Commodus didn't just abandon his father's party reforms. He actively rebelled against them with the enthusiasm of a teenager whose parents had just left for vacation. Within months of taking power, he was throwing banquets that made Caligula's naval battle dinner look like a quiet book club meeting. The pendulum swung so far in the opposite direction that it practically broke the cultural measuring device. New challenges were immediate and predictable. Romans who had spent years adjusting to intellectual entertainment and sustainable party budgets suddenly found themselves back in an environment where failing to appreciate gladiator matches during dinner could be interpreted as political disloyalty. The entertainment industry, which had been struggling to adapt to educational programming, suddenly faced overwhelming demand for performers who could provide the kind of shock value that had been out of fashion for nearly 2 decades. But evolution wasn't simply a return to pre-Marcus Aurelius party culture. Romans had experienced what it was like to attend social gatherings without risking their lives, and some of them had discovered they actually preferred conversations that didn't require dodging projectiles or pretending to enjoy watching people die. This created a cultural split between traditionalist party culture and what became known as reformed party culture. The split manifested in different social circles, developing completely different entertainment standards. Military commanders and government administrators often maintained the intellectual discussion format they had grown to appreciate, while wealthy Romans with more time and fewer responsibilities reverted to competitive excess. This created the bizarre situation where the same empire simultaneously hosted both philosophy seminars with wine and gladiator death matches with dinner, depending on whose party you attended. Second-generation effects included the development of hybrid party formats that attempted to combine intellectual content with traditional Roman excess. These events featured educational lectures followed by arena combat, or philosophical debates where the losers were fed to exotic animals. It was like Romans were trying to have their intellectual cake and eat their violence too, which satisfied no one and confused everyone. The most significant development was the emergence of regional variations in party culture. Different provinces began developing their own interpretations of what constituted appropriate entertainment, leading to a more diverse but also more chaotic social landscape. Egyptian-influenced parties featured different types of excess than Germanic-influenced ones, and traveling Romans needed cultural guides to navigate the varying entertainment expectations in different parts of the empire. The economic implications were substantial. The entertainment industry experienced boom and bust cycles as emperors alternated between supporting traditional excess and reformed moderation. Professional entertainers had to maintain skills in both educational presentation and traditional shock performance, leading to the emergence of versatile performers who could switch between philosophical lectures and gladiator combat depending on the political climate. The post-Marcus Aurelius era introduced a fascinating cast of characters who specialized in navigating the increasingly complex world of Roman party politics. These weren't just entertainers or hosts, they were cultural entrepreneurs who recognized that the instability in party culture created opportunities for people who could successfully adapt to rapidly changing entertainment expectations. Galen's innovation was developing the first systematic approach to party medicine. He created classification systems for different types of entertainment-related injuries, established treatment protocols for exotic animal attacks, and even wrote medical guides for hosts who wanted to provide dangerous entertainment without actually killing their guests. His services became so popular that Galen-certified parties became a mark of prestige. You could offer extreme entertainment while maintaining plausible deniability about guest safety. The irony was that Galen, who was trying to make Roman parties safer, actually enabled them to become more extreme by reducing the risk of permanent consequences. Hosts who might have hesitated to include deadly entertainment in their events felt more confident when they had professional medical support available. Galen inadvertently became an enabler of the very behavior he was trying to make less dangerous. Another key figure was Septimia Zenobia, a wealthy widow who revolutionized Roman party culture by introducing what she called competitive hospitality leagues. Zenobia recognized that Romans missed the competitive aspect of party culture, but were also tired of the financial and physical costs of traditional extreme entertainment. Her solution was to create formal competition systems where hosts could compete for social recognition without having to constantly escalate their entertainment budgets. Zenobia's leagues featured different categories of party competition: most educational, most creative, most cost-effective, and most memorable. Hosts submitted their party plans to panels of judges who evaluated them based on innovation, execution, and guest satisfaction, rather than just expense and shock value. Winners received social recognition and advancement opportunities, while losers faced only mild embarrassment rather than social exile or financial ruin. The league system became wildly popular because it provided the competitive element Romans craved while making party culture more sustainable and less dangerous. It also created opportunities for Romans who were creative, but not necessarily wealthy, to achieve social advancement through innovative party planning rather than just expensive resource display. Perhaps most importantly, the leagues introduced The concept of party planning as a skill that could be developed and evaluated objectively, rather than just an expression of personal wealth and tolerance for extreme behavior. This professionalized party culture in ways that made it more accessible to Romans who had been excluded from traditional elite. Entertainment culture. Zenobia's personal story was also significant. As a widow, she had social freedom that married. Women lacked, and she used that freedom to reshape Roman social culture in ways that benefited people who had been marginalized by traditional party hierarchies. Her success demonstrated that Roman party culture could evolve beyond its origins in male aristocratic competition. But some problems persisted despite all attempts at reform and innovation. The fundamental issue with Roman party culture was that it had become disconnected from any practical purpose beyond social competition, and no amount of structural reform could solve the underlying problem that wealthy Romans had more resources than they knew what to do with, and insufficient productive outlets for their competitive instincts. The escalation problem never went away. Even reformed party culture eventually succumbed to competitive pressure, with hosts trying to outdo each other's educational programming, safety innovations, or creative entertainment concepts. Philosophical debates became increasingly elaborate. Productions featuring professional actors, visual aids, and dramatic staging that defeated the original purpose of intellectual discussion. It was like Romans were genetically incapable of doing anything in moderation, even when they were specifically trying to be moderate. New versions of old problems emerged regularly. Instead of competing over who could serve the most expensive food, reformed party culture featured competition over who could provide the most innovative educational experiences. Instead of trying to shock guests with extreme violence, hosts tried to shock them with unexpected intellectual challenges or creative conversation formats. The underlying competitive dynamic remained the same, just expressed through different activities. Economic problems persisted because party culture continued to consume enormous resources regardless of its specific format. Educational entertainment might be less expensive than gladiator matches, but when you're importing philosophers from Greece, commissioning custom educational materials, and building specialized discussion facilities, the costs add up quickly. Romans had simply replaced one type of excessive spending with another type of excessive spending. Why certain issues proved intractable relates to fundamental aspects of Roman social structure and psychology. The empire had created a class of people with unlimited resources and social obligations that required constant demonstration of their status and success. Party culture served essential social functions that couldn't be eliminated without fundamentally restructuring Roman society, which no one was willing or able to do. Cyclical patterns developed where party culture would become moderate and sustainable for a few years, then gradually escalate until it reached crisis levels, prompting another round of reform efforts that would temporarily restore moderation before the cycle repeated. Each generation of Romans seemed to rediscover the same problems and attempt the same solutions with the same mixed results. The persistence of these patterns suggests that Roman party culture was a symptom of deeper social and economic issues, rather than just a cultural quirk that could be reformed through better management. The empire had created conditions where competitive excess was not just encouraged but required for social and political success, and party culture was simply one expression of that broader dynamic. International complications also persisted. Foreign diplomats and trade partners continued to be confused and sometimes horrified by Roman social customs, regardless of whether those customs involved gladiator matches or competitive philosophy. The fundamental weirdness of Roman party culture transcended its specific format, creating ongoing challenges for international relations and cultural exchange. The most persistent issue was that Romans never developed sustainable mechanisms for satisfying their competitive instincts and social status needs without creating new forms of excess. Every attempt to reform party culture eventually resulted in new types of competitive behavior that reproduced the original problems in different forms. It was like trying to cure an addiction by switching to a different substance. The underlying compulsive behavior remained unchanged, though compared to earlier periods of Roman history. The post-Marcus Aurelius era represented both progress and regression, in ways that perfectly captured the contradictions of Roman civilization. The early republic had featured relatively simple social gatherings focused on political discussion and community building. But those occurred in a society with limited resources and clear external threats that focused competitive energies on practical goals. Imperial Rome had virtually unlimited resources and no serious external challenges, which created the conditions for party culture to become an end in itself, rather than a means of strengthening social bonds for practical purposes. The comparison reveals how wealth and security can create their own problems when societies lack productive outlets for human competitive instincts. What was unique about Roman party culture was its combination of sophisticated organization with complete disconnection from practical purpose. Other ancient civilizations had elaborate celebrations and festivals, but these typically served religious, agricultural, or political functions that benefited the broader community. Roman elite party culture was perhaps history's first example of entertainment, becoming purely consumptive rather than serving any broader social function. What was universal about Roman party behavior was the human tendency to use competitive display for social positioning and the way that competitive dynamics can escalate beyond rational limits when external constraints are removed. Similar patterns appear throughout history whenever societies develop significant wealth inequality and weak social institutions. For managing competitive behavior, lessons that could be learned from Roman party culture include the importance of maintaining productive outlets for competitive instincts, the dangers of allowing social status to become divorced from social contribution, and the difficulty of reforming cultural practices that serve essential psychological and social functions, even when their specific expressions are destructive. The patterns that repeated elsewhere throughout history are depressingly familiar. Wealthy elites competing for status through increasingly elaborate displays, entertainment culture becoming disconnected from artistic or educational value, and the normalization of extreme behavior when it becomes associated with social success. Roman party culture essentially provided a template for aristocratic excess that has been replicated in various forms throughout European and world history, suggesting that these patterns represent fundamental aspects of how humans respond to wealth, power, and social competition rather than quirks specific to Roman civilization. By the 3rd century CE, signs pointed to major changes coming to Roman party culture, though most wealthy Romans were too busy arguing about proper peacock preparation techniques to notice that their entire civilization was developing some serious structural problems. The warning signs were everywhere: economic instability, military pressures, political chaos, and the growing influence of religious movements that took a dim view of competitive vomiting as sophisticated entertainment. The economic indicators were particularly ominous. The empire was spending more on frontier defense, dealing with inflation that made exotic party supplies increasingly expensive, and facing tax collection problems that reduced the imperial treasury's ability to fund the kind of spectacular excess that had become expected at official events. When importing snow from the Alps for chilled wine started requiring special imperial permits due to budget constraints, astute observers might have realized that changes were coming. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the fundamental disconnect between Roman elite culture and practical reality. Professional party planners noticed that their clients were having trouble paying bills and that suppliers were demanding payment in advance. rather than extending credit. Military commanders observed that resources were being diverted from defense to entertainment at a time when barbarian tribes were becoming increasingly aggressive and organized. But most wealthy Romans remained focused on immediate social competition rather than long-term trends. They could see that individual families were facing financial difficulties, but they interpreted this as personal failures rather than systemic problems. They noticed that some traditional entertainment options were becoming unavailable, but they responded by innovating new forms of excess rather than questioning whether competitive party culture was sustainable. The imperial administration showed similar selective blindness. Emperors could see that the treasury was under pressure, but they continued funding elaborate imperial parties because canceling them would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. Government officials understood that military spending was critical, but they also knew that social events were essential for maintaining political alliances and diplomatic relationships. Resistance to inevitable change took predictable forms. Some wealthy Romans responded to economic pressure by borrowing money to maintain their party standards, reasoning that temporary financial difficulties shouldn't force them to compromise their social obligations. Others attempted to find cost-saving measures that would allow them to maintain the appearance of traditional excess while reducing actual expenses, leading to innovations like reusable gladiators, rental exotic animals, and party entertainment financing plans. The most telling sign was the emergence of nostalgia parties, where hosts attempted to recreate famous historical banquets from previous generations. When your party culture becomes focused on copying past achievements rather than innovating new ones, you're probably looking at a civilization that has run out of creative energy and is beginning to eat itself culturally. Religious movements were also gaining influence among Romans who had grown tired of party culture's demands and expense. Christianity, in particular, offered social communities that didn't require members to bankruptcy themselves through competitive hospitality, which was an attractive alternative for Romans who wanted social connection without the financial and psychological costs of traditional elite entertainment. The end of classical Roman party culture didn't arrive with a dramatic final banquet or imperial decree. It dissolved gradually over several decades of economic crisis, political instability, and cultural transformation that made traditional elite entertainment increasingly irrelevant to Roman survival. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE, essentially killed competitive party culture through a combination of hyperinflation, civil wars, and external invasions that forced even wealthy Romans to focus on more practical concerns than peacock brain preparation. The specific events that marked the transition were less dramatic than the circumstances that made them possible. Emperor Aurelian's monetary reforms in the 270s CE effectively ended the economic conditions that had supported extreme party culture by stabilizing currency, but also dramatically reducing the purchasing power of traditional Roman wealth. Suddenly, families that had spent generations competing over party expenses found themselves unable to afford basic imported luxuries, let alone exotic entertainment. The final major players in imperial party culture were a sad collection of emperors who tried to maintain traditional entertainment standards while dealing with barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political instability. Emperor Probus, 276 to 282 CE, was probably the last emperor to throw genuinely traditional Roman banquets, featuring gladiator matches and exotic animals. But even his parties were modest affairs compared to earlier imperial standards. By then, most of the empire's exotic animal suppliers had been disrupted by warfare. Professional entertainers had fled to safer regions, and the imperial treasury was focused on paying soldiers rather than funding dinner entertainment. The last attempts to preserve traditional party culture were both pathetic and oddly touching. Some wealthy Roman families continued hosting elaborate dinners throughout the crisis period, using up their accumulated wealth to maintain social traditions, even as their political and economic foundations crumbled. These final parties often featured entertainment that was simultaneously traditional and improvised. Gladiator matches using kitchen slaves instead of professional fighters. Exotic animals that were actually local livestock with creative decorations. And imported delicacies that were actually local foods prepared with expensive spices. One particularly poignant example involved a senator who spent his family's remaining wealth on what he declared would be the last traditional Roman banquet ever held. The event featured all the classical elements, multiple courses of exotic food, professional entertainment, elaborate decorations, and enough wine to float a small warship. But the professional entertainers were unemployed actors hired for a fraction of their former fees. The exotic animals were borrowed from a traveling circus, and the imported delicacies were local foods prepared by the host's own kitchen staff using techniques learned from cookbooks. The evening was both a celebration of Roman party culture and a funeral for it. Guests spent the night reminiscing about the great parties of previous generations while acknowledging that this type of entertainment was no longer economically or politically sustainable. Several attendees reportedly became emotional during the final course, realizing they were witnessing the end of a cultural tradition that had defined Roman elite society for centuries. Thought dramatic final moments came not from any specific party or imperial decision, but from the gradual recognition that Roman party culture had become as obsolete as other aspects of classical civilization. When Constantine founded Constantinople in 330 CE and established a new imperial capital with explicitly Christian cultural values, traditional Roman entertainment was relegated to historical curiosity rather than living social practice. The symbolic endpoints varied depending on perspective. Military historians might point to the abandonment of gladiatorial games in the 5th century as the final end of Roman entertainment culture. Social historians might identify the last recorded private banquet featuring traditional extreme entertainment. Economic historians might focus on the final collapse of the luxury goods trade networks that had supplied Roman party culture. But perhaps the most appropriate symbolic ending was the conversion of former party venues into churches, monasteries, and other religious institutions. The dining rooms that had once hosted competitive vomiting and gladiator matches became spaces for prayer and contemplation. The architectural spaces remained, but their social function was completely transformed, which seems like a fitting metaphor for the end of Roman party culture itself. The analysis of why Roman party culture ended reveals a complex interaction between internal contradictions and external pressures that made traditional elite entertainment both economically impossible and culturally irrelevant. The internal problems had been building for centuries, but external pressures provided the catalyst that finally forced fundamental change. Internal problems included the basic unsustainability of competitive excess as a social organizing principle. Roman party culture had created a system where social status required constantly escalating displays of wealth and creativity. But escalating displays eventually reach limits imposed by available resources and human tolerance for extreme behavior. By the 3rd century, Romans had essentially exhausted the possibilities for innovation in competitive entertainment. There were only so many ways to combine exotic animals, professional violence, and expensive food before even jaded Roman audiences became bored. The economic contradictions were equally fundamental. Party culture had evolved into a system that consumed enormous resources while producing nothing of economic value. Unlike other forms of elite consumption that at least supported productive industries, architecture, literature, military equipment, party entertainment was purely consumptive. The resources spent on a single elaborate banquet could have funded infrastructure projects, military equipment, or economic development that would have benefited the empire's long-term stability. External pressures came from multiple directions. Simultaneously, military threats from Germanic tribes, Persian armies, and internal rebellions forced the empire to redirect resources from entertainment to defense. Economic pressures from inflation, tax collection problems, and trade disruption made traditional luxury consumption increasingly difficult to sustain. Political instability meant that emperors had to focus on survival rather than social recognition through elaborate parties. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending party culture was probably weighted toward historical forces. While specific emperors and social leaders made decisions that accelerated the transition away from traditional entertainment, the underlying economic and political pressures would likely have produced similar results regardless of individual choices. The empire had reached a point where traditional elite culture was simply incompatible with survival needs. What could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question. If Roman party culture had evolved toward more sustainable forms of competitive social display, perhaps focusing on artistic achievement, public service, or economic innovation rather than pure consumption, it might have continued in modified form. But this would have required fundamental changes in Roman values and social structure that were probably impossible within the existing system. The question of inevitability versus contingency is complex. Some form of transformation was probably inevitable given the economic and political pressures facing the empire, but the specific form that transformation took was influenced by contingent factors like the rise of Christianity, the particular sequence of military crises, and the individual decisions of emperors and other leaders. The cultural factors that contributed to the end included the growing influence of religious movements that offered alternative forms of social community and meaning. Christianity, in particular, provided social structures that didn't require competitive consumption for membership and status. This gave Romans alternatives to traditional party culture that met their social needs without the associated costs and risks. Perhaps most importantly, Roman party culture ended because it had lost its original social function. What had begun as a way for elite Romans to demonstrate their success and build political alliances had evolved into pure entertainment that served no practical purpose. When the empire faced existential threats, people naturally abandoned activities that consumed resources without contributing to survival, regardless of their traditional cultural importance. The immediate aftermath of Roman party culture's decline was like watching a society experience collective withdrawal symptoms from an addiction to competitive excess. Romans who had spent their entire lives organizing their social calendars around elaborate entertainment suddenly found themselves with enormous amounts of free time and no clear idea what to do with it that didn't involve exotic animals or professional gladiators. Who stepped into the vacuum was initially unclear, creating a period of social experimentation where different groups tried to establish new norms for elite entertainment and social interaction. Christian communities offered one alternative, emphasizing communal meals and religious celebration over competitive display. Military commanders, dealing with constant crisis, developed practical social networks focused on strategic planning and resource sharing rather than entertainment. Some former party industry professionals successfully transitioned to new careers. Professional entertainers found work in religious contexts, providing music and performance for church services and religious festivals. Exotic animal trainers became zookeepers or worked for traveling circuses that entertained common people rather than elite audiences. Specialized chefs adapted their skills to monastery kitchens or developed businesses serving simpler but well-prepared food to middle-class customers. Short-term consequences included both relief and disorientation among former participants in Party culture. Many Romans discovered they actually enjoyed social gatherings that didn't require months of planning, enormous financial investment, or personal risk assessment. Government officials appreciated being able to conduct business without having to schedule around elaborate entertainment requirements or recover from party-related injuries. But there was also genuine loss. Roman party culture, however extreme and problematic, had represented a form of artistic and social innovation that disappeared when it ended. The organizational skills, creative energy, and cultural sophistication that had gone into planning elaborate banquets were not easily redirected toward other activities. Contemporary reactions included attempts to revive traditional party culture. On smaller scales, nostalgia for the good old days when social life had been more exciting, and relief that Romans could finally have normal dinner parties without requiring medical staff on standby. Some former hosts attempted to maintain modified versions of traditional entertainment, leading to a period of cultural experimentation where people tried to preserve the positive aspects of party culture while eliminating the problematic elements. The most significant immediate consequence was that Roman elite culture became more integrated with practical governance and economic activity rather than existing as a separate sphere of competitive consumption. The legacy of Roman party culture shaped later developments in ways that would have horrified Marcus Aurelius and probably amused Caligula, though for completely different reasons. Medieval European nobility essentially used Roman banquets as an instruction manual for how to demonstrate wealth and power through competitive entertainment. Except they somehow managed to make the whole enterprise even more expensive and slightly less hygienic than the original version. Specific influences can be traced through virtually every subsequent European civilization that had access to Roman historical records. Byzantine emperors continued imperial banquet traditions, though with more religious themes and fewer gladiator matches. Apparently, Christianity improved the survival rate for dinner guests, but didn't entirely eliminate the tendency toward elaborate food presentation and competitive hosting. Medieval courts throughout Europe adopted Roman-inspired feast structures, complete with multiple courses, entertainment between serving periods, and seating arrangements that functioned as detailed maps of political hierarchy. The Renaissance saw a full revival of Roman party aesthetics, with wealthy Italian families competing to recreate classical banquets based on surviving descriptions from Roman authors. The Medici family, in particular, threw parties that would have made ancient Romans proud, featuring elaborate allegorical entertainment, exotic foods, and enough artistic pretension to choke a philosophy professor. They even hired scholars to research authentic Roman recipes in entertainment formats, proving that historical accuracy could be just as expensive as creative innovation. How later generations viewed Roman party culture reveals fascinating shifts in moral and cultural attitudes. Medieval chroniclers generally condemned Roman excess while secretly copying detailed descriptions of party menus and entertainment options for their patrons' reference. Renaissance humanists celebrated Roman sophistication while diplomatically ignoring the parts about murdering people for dinner entertainment. Enlightenment philosophers use Roman parties as examples of how wealth and power could corrupt moral judgment, while simultaneously hosting elaborate salons that reproduced many of the same competitive social dynamics, the myths versus realities, that developed around Roman party culture often made the historical truth even more extreme than it actually was. Popular imagination focused on the most sensational aspects, narrow fiddling while Rome burned, Caligula making his horse a consul, orgies and poisonings, while ignoring the more mundane reality that most Roman parties were just very expensive. Dinner gatherings with slightly above-average entertainment and significantly above-average food costs that these myths served important cultural functions for later societies. Roman party stories became cautionary tales about the dangers of excessive wealth, the corruption of power, and the importance of maintaining moral restraint even when you could afford to abandon it completely. Every European court that threw elaborate parties could point to Roman examples and reassure themselves that at least they weren't feeding dinner guests to lions, which set a remarkably low bar for acceptable entertainment standards. Why Roman party culture remained important to later cultures relates to fundamental human psychology and social organization. Every society with significant wealth inequality and competitive elite culture faces the same basic question. How do people with unlimited resources demonstrate their status and compete for social recognition? Roman party culture provided a template that could be adapted to different religious, cultural, and economic contexts while serving the same underlying social functions. The academic study of Roman parties also became important for understanding broader historical patterns. Historians studying the decline of civilizations found that elite party culture often served as an early indicator of social problems. When a society's wealthy classes become more focused on competitive entertainment than productive activity, it usually signals deeper issues with resource allocation and social priorities. Most importantly, Roman party culture demonstrated the difference between wealth and civilization. Romans proved that you could have unlimited resources, sophisticated technology, and impressive cultural achievements while still behaving in ways that were fundamentally destructive and unsustainable. Today, we can see echoes of Roman party culture in ways that are both obvious and uncomfortably specific. Though modern versions tend to feature fewer gladiator matches and more social media documentation, the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably similar. Wealthy people competing for social recognition through increasingly elaborate displays of resources, entertainment that prioritizes shock value over artistic merit, and the normalization of extreme behavior when it becomes associated with social success. The most obvious parallel is contemporary celebrity culture, where entertainment industry figures compete to throw the most talked about parties, featuring the most expensive venues, the most exclusive guest lists, and the most outrageous entertainment concepts. Modern celebrity parties routinely cost more than most people's annual salaries, feature entertainment that exists primarily to generate social media buzz, and create hierarchies based on who gets invited and where they're positioned in the social geography of the event. Tech billionaire party culture represents perhaps the closest modern equivalent to Roman imperial banquets. Silicon Valley gatherings featuring private island venues, celebrity entertainment, and experimental technology. Demonstrations that cost millions of dollars while serving no practical purpose, beyond demonstrating the host's wealth and creativity. The same competitive dynamics that drove Romans to import snow from mountains for chilled wine now drive tech entrepreneurs to hire entire orchestras for private performances or commission custom art installations for single-use party decorations. Corporate entertainment culture has also adopted Roman-style competitive excess, with companies throwing elaborate parties, conferences, and team-building events that function more as status displays than business activities. The modern equivalent of Roman exotic animal entertainment might be corporate retreats featuring expensive speakers, elaborate themed decorations, and entertainment budgets that exceed entire departments' annual operating costs. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency to use competitive display for social positioning, and the way that competitive dynamics can escalate beyond rational limits when external constraints are removed. Modern wealthy individuals still compete for social recognition through party hosting, still try to outdo each other's entertainment innovations, and still normalize extreme behavior when it becomes associated with social success. The social media aspect adds a new dimension that Romans didn't have to deal with. Modern party culture is not just about impressing the people who attend your events. but about creating content that will impress people who see documentation of your events. This creates additional pressure for visual impact and novelty that would have made Roman party planners weep with recognition and competitive envy. Similar patterns in different contexts appear throughout modern society. Academic conferences feature competitive hosting by universities trying to demonstrate their prestige through venue selection, entertainment quality, and catering expenses. Political fundraising events use many of the same dynamics as Roman banquets, with donors competing for access and recognition through their ability to pay for increasingly elaborate campaign gatherings. The wedding industry represents perhaps the most widespread modern adoption of Roman party principles, with couples and families competing to throw the most memorable celebrations through venue selection, entertainment booking, and overall expense that often exceeds reasonable financial limits. The pressure to create unique and unforgettable wedding experiences drives the same kind of innovation in extreme entertainment that characterized Roman banquet culture. Lessons for contemporary issues are uncomfortable but clear. Modern societies that allow wealth to become completely disconnected from social responsibility, that celebrate competitive consumption over productive achievement, and that normalize extreme behavior through association with social success are likely to experience similar problems to those that plagued Roman party culture. The specific forms of excess change with available technology and cultural context, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. The most relevant lesson is that societies need productive outlets for competitive instincts and effective mechanisms for ensuring that wealth serves broader social functions rather than just private entertainment. When economic success becomes disconnected from social contribution and competitive energy gets focused on pure consumption rather than innovation or public service, the results are predictably destructive, regardless of the specific historical context. Modern regulatory frameworks, social norms, and economic structures provide some constraints that didn't exist in Roman times. But these constraints are constantly being tested by people who have more resources than they know what to do with and insufficient productive outlets for their competitive energy. Even now, Roman party culture influences multiple areas of modern life in ways that are both subtle and pervasive. Academic study of Roman social history has become essential for understanding how elite culture functions in any society with significant wealth inequality, providing frameworks for analyzing contemporary social dynamics and predicting potential problems before they become destructive. Popular culture remains fascinated with Roman party stories, which appear regularly in films, television shows, novels, and other entertainment media. These depictions usually focus on the most sensational aspects of Roman excess, but they serve important cultural functions by providing cautionary tales about wealth, power, and the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries, even in private settings. Political discourse frequently references Roman examples when discussing contemporary issues related to wealth inequality, political corruption, and social responsibility. Politicians and commentators use Roman party culture as a shorthand for describing the dangers of allowing elite culture to become disconnected from public service and social contribution. Social movements advocating for economic reform, wealth redistribution, and corporate responsibility often point to Roman examples as historical evidence of what happens when societies allow unlimited accumulation of resources without corresponding social obligations. Roman party culture serves as a historical case study for arguments about taxation, regulation, and the social responsibilities of wealthy individuals and institutions. The hospitality and entertainment industries continue to draw inspiration from Roman party concepts, though usually in modified forms that eliminate the more problematic elements while preserving the focus on elaborate presentation, exotic experiences, and competitive innovation. Modern event planning, luxury tourism, and high-end restaurant culture all show clear influences from Roman entertainment traditions. Why people still care about Roman party culture relates to its continued relevance for understanding fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between wealth and civilization. Roman parties provide a historical laboratory for examining how people behave when normal constraints are removed, and what happens to societies that prioritize consumption over production. Most importantly, Roman party culture remains relevant because the same underlying social and psychological dynamics that created it continue to operate in modern societies. As long as humans organize themselves into hierarchical societies with significant resource inequality, the lessons learned from Roman party culture will remain applicable for understanding and managing the challenges of wealth, power, and social responsibility. The journey through Roman party culture reveals patterns that are both historically specific and universally human, showing how a civilization at the height of its power and sophistication could simultaneously achieve remarkable cultural and technological advances while developing social customs that were fundamentally destructive and unsustainable. The Romans managed to build roads that lasted for millennia, while hosting parties that couldn't be sustained for more than a few generations without bankrupting the participants. What makes Roman party culture particularly fascinating is how it demonstrates the complex relationship between individual psychology and social systems. The same competitive instincts that drove Romans to conquer most of the known world also drove them to compete over who could serve the most expensive peacock brains at dinner parties. The organizational skills that enabled them to manage a vast empire were also applied to planning entertainment events that served no purpose beyond temporary amusement. The story of Roman parties is ultimately a story about what happens when human capabilities exceed human wisdom, when technological and economic success outpaces moral and social development, and when societies fail to develop sustainable mechanisms for managing success and prosperity. It's a cautionary tale that remains relevant precisely because the underlying human tendencies it reveals haven't changed significantly in the 2,000 years since the last Roman banquet featured gladiator matches during dinner. Understanding Roman party culture helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time and provides historical perspective for evaluating contemporary debates about wealth, inequality, and social responsibility. The specific details of Roman excess may seem alien to modern sensibilities, but the underlying dynamics of competitive consumption, status display, and the normalization of extreme behavior through association with social success are immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with contemporary elite culture. Most importantly, the Roman example demonstrates that civilizations can survive remarkable amounts of elite dysfunction and competitive excess, but only up to a point. When the costs of maintaining extreme party culture began to exceed the empire's ability to sustain them, the culture changed, whether people wanted it to or not, a lesson that remains relevant for any society struggling to balance prosperity with sustainability. Looking back across nearly 4 centuries of Roman party culture, we've seen a civilization transform simple dinner gatherings into an art form of competitive excess that would make modern event planners require therapy and insurance adjusters quit their jobs. The major themes that emerge from this journey reveal patterns that are both uniquely Roman and disturbingly universal in their implications for understanding human behavior when normal constraints are removed. Key patterns include the inevitable escalation of competitive social display once it becomes disconnected from practical purpose. Romans started with reasonable dinner parties and ended up with emperors staging naval battles in dining rooms while dinner guests tried to maintain polite conversation around flying projectiles and screaming combatants. This escalation wasn't accidental. It was the logical result of a social system that rewarded innovation in excess while providing no mechanisms for determining when enough had been achieved. The most surprising discoveries revealed how quickly sophisticated people can normalize absolutely insane behavior when it becomes associated with social success and cultural sophistication. Romans who could design aqueducts, write poetry, and govern provinces somehow convinced themselves that watching people die during dinner was the height of civilized entertainment. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this perspective, while simultaneously lecturing others about virtue and moderation, suggests that humans are remarkably capable of compartmentalizing their ethical standards when social pressure demands it. Most important takeaways center on the relationship between wealth, power, and social responsibility. Roman party culture demonstrated what happens when economic success becomes disconnected from social contribution and competitive energy gets focused on pure consumption rather than productive achievement. The resources spent on a single elaborate banquet could have built infrastructure, funded education, or supported military campaigns that would have benefited the empire's long-term stability. But instead, they were literally consumed for a few hours of entertainment that served no purpose beyond temporary amusement. How our understanding evolved throughout this exploration reveals the complexity of judging historical behavior from modern perspectives. What initially appeared to be simple examples of wealthy people behaving badly turned out to be symptoms of deeper social and economic contradictions that ultimately contributed to the empire's decline. Roman party culture wasn't just a colorful historical anecdote. It was a case study in how civilizations can destroy themselves through their own success when they fail to develop sustainable mechanisms for managing prosperity. The journey also revealed how historical patterns repeat across different cultural contexts with remarkably consistent underlying dynamics. The same competitive instincts that drove Romans to import exotic animals for dinner entertainment drive modern people to compete over social media influence, celebrity party invitations, and luxury lifestyle displays. The specific forms of excess change with available technology and cultural norms, but the psychological and social mechanisms remain essentially unchanged. Perhaps most importantly, this exploration demonstrated that understanding historical examples of extreme behavior can provide valuable perspective for evaluating contemporary social issues and recognizing potentially destructive patterns before they reach crisis levels. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes we've explored involves the last recorded traditional Roman banquet, held sometime in the early 4th century CE by a senator whose name has been lost to history, but whose party, playing philosophy, perfectly captured the contradictions and ultimate futility of Roman party culture. This unnamed senator, facing the reality that traditional Roman party culture was ending due to economic and political pressures, decided to throw what he explicitly advertised as the final classical Roman banquet, an event that would preserve all the traditional elements of Roman entertainment while acknowledging that this type of gathering was no longer sustainable or socially acceptable. The evening featured every classical Roman party element in miniature: gladiator matches using kitchen, slaves armed with serving utensils, exotic animals borrowed from a traveling circus, courses of expensive food prepared using the last of the host's imported spices, and entertainment that managed to be simultaneously traditional and completely improvised. Guests were invited to participate in competitive vomiting between courses, philosophical debates about the nature of excess, and a final ceremony where everyone present formally acknowledged that they were witnessing the end of an era. What makes this story so perfect is how it reveals the self-awareness that Romans had developed about their own party culture by the end. They understood that their entertainment traditions had become unsustainable and problematic, but they also felt nostalgic about losing something that had defined their social identity for centuries. The final banquet was simultaneously a celebration and a funeral, a preservation effort and an acknowledgement of failure. The evening concluded with the host giving a speech about how future generations would probably judge Roman party culture harshly, while missing the genuine creativity, organizational skill, and social innovation that had gone into developing these traditions. He argued that Roman parties, however extreme and problematic, had represented a form of artistic and cultural achievement that deserved recognition, even as it was being abandoned. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes is that it demonstrates how civilizations can simultaneously recognize their own destructive behaviors while feeling attached to them for cultural and emotional reasons. The unnamed senator understood that Roman party culture was unsustainable, but he also appreciated the sophistication and creativity that had gone into developing it. What it reveals about everything we've discussed is the complex relationship between individual agency and historical forces. Romans weren't mindless victims of their culture. They made conscious choices about how to spend their resources and organize their social lives. But they also operated within systems that made certain choices seem reasonable or necessary, even when those choices were ultimately destructive. How it connects to everything discussed throughout our journey is by showing that Roman party culture was never just about entertainment. It was about identity, social status, competitive achievement, and cultural preservation. When Romans gave up their traditional party culture, they weren't just changing their entertainment preferences. They were fundamentally altering their understanding of what it meant to be Roman, successful and culturally sophisticated. The memorable final image from this last banquet was reportedly the host and his guests standing in his damaged dining room after the evening's entertainment, surrounded by the debris of broken furniture, scattered food, and various entertainment-related casualties, toasting the end of an era with cups of wine mixed with their own tears, a fitting metaphor for a civilization that had achieved remarkable heights while simultaneously undermining its own foundations. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinth of Roman party culture, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the sheer human creativity that went into developing entertainment traditions that were simultaneously impressive and completely insane. Romans may have lost perspective about sustainable social behavior, but they never lost their capacity for innovation, organization, and dramatic spectacle. The general conclusion we can draw from this exploration is that understanding historical examples of extreme behavior helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time and provides perspective for making better choices about how we use our resources, organize our social lives, and balance individual desires with collective responsibilities. Roman party culture ultimately teaches us that civilization is a fragile achievement that requires conscious effort to maintain. Prosperity and technological advancement don't automatically lead to wisdom or sustainable social practices. Those have to be developed and preserved through deliberate choices about values, priorities, and the kinds of communities we want to create. Perhaps the most peaceful closing thought is that humans have always struggled with questions about how to live well, how to use resources responsibly, and how to balance individual achievement with social contribution. The Romans tried one approach and learned valuable lessons through their spectacular failures. We have the opportunity to learn from their example and hopefully make better choices about our own party planning and everything else. The story of Roman party culture invites us to reflect on fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual desires and collective well-being that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. What drives people to compete for social recognition through increasingly elaborate displays of wealth and creativity? How do societies develop sustainable mechanisms for managing prosperity and success? When does healthy competition become destructive? Excess And how can communities recognize and address these transitions before they become problematic? These questions don't have simple answers, but exploring them through historical examples like Roman party culture provides valuable perspective for understanding contemporary challenges. Modern societies face similar issues with wealth inequality, competitive consumption, social media-driven status competition, and the challenge of ensuring that economic success serves broader social purposes rather than just private entertainment. The Roman example suggests that these challenges are not unique to our time or culture. They represent fundamental aspects of how humans respond to prosperity, social hierarchies, and competitive pressures. Every generation has to figure out how to balance individual achievement with collective responsibility, how to channel competitive instincts toward productive rather than destructive ends, and how to maintain ethical standards even when wealth and power make it tempting to abandon them. Reflecting on Roman party culture also raises questions about the relationship between cultural sophistication and moral wisdom. Romans achieved remarkable advances in engineering, law, literature, and governance while simultaneously developing social customs that were fundamentally problematic. This suggests that technological and cultural progress don't automatically lead to improved judgment about social behavior. Wisdom and ethical development require separate, conscious effort. The persistence of similar patterns across different historical contexts implies that these challenges reflect deep aspects of human psychology rather than just cultural quirks specific to particular societies. Understanding these patterns can help us recognize potentially problematic developments in our own communities and make more informed choices about the kinds of social norms and institutions we want to support. Perhaps most importantly, the Roma example demonstrates that change is possible even when destructive patterns have become deeply entrenched in social culture. Marcus Aurelius's party reforms showed that societies can step back from competitive excess and develop more sustainable approaches to social interaction and entertainment. The fact that these reforms didn't last permanently doesn't diminish their value as proof that conscious cultural change is possible when people recognize the need for it. The invitation to reflection extends beyond just party culture to broader questions about how we organize our communities, allocate our resources, and define success and achievement. Roman party culture was ultimately a symptom of deeper social and economic structures that prioritized individual competition over collective well-being and short-term gratification over long-term sustainability. Contemporary parallels in corporate culture, celebrity entertainment, social media competition, and political fundraising suggest that these underlying dynamics continue to operate in modern contexts. Recognizing these patterns can help us make more conscious choices about the kinds of behaviors we reward, the types of competition we encourage, and the social norms we support through our participation and attention. The reflection process also involves considering what positive lessons can be drawn from Roman innovations in social organization, entertainment, and cultural development. Romans demonstrated remarkable creativity, organizational skill, and capacity for social coordination that produced genuine achievements alongside the problematic aspects of their party culture. The challenge is learning to preserve and build on positive human capabilities while developing better mechanisms for preventing their application toward destructive ends. Ultimately, reflecting on Roman party culture encourages us to think about what kinds of communities we want to create, what values we want to prioritize, and how we can channel human competitive instincts and creative energy toward purposes that enhance rather than undermine collective well-being. The Romans provide both cautionary examples of what to avoid and inspiring examples of human capability that can be directed toward more constructive purposes. The most valuable aspect of this reflection may be developing greater awareness of how our own choices and behaviors contribute to larger social patterns, and how conscious attention to these dynamics can help us make decisions that support the kinds of communities and cultures we actually want to live in rather than just the ones that emerge by default from unexamined competitive pressures and social expectations.